The frigid glass of the restaurant window did little to numb the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the biting November air swirling through the Boston parking lot. Inside, laughter glittered like the chandeliers overhead, a symphony of joy I was meant to be part of. I could just make out the silhouette of my granddaughter, Aurelia, surrounded by a constellation of her friends, her face illuminated by the glow of birthday candles. In my hands, I clutched the white box containing the lemon-lavender cake I had baked, its sweet scent a ghostly accusation in the darkness. My breath fogged the pane of glass, a temporary veil between my world and hers. Then, through the muffled symphony, a voice sliced through the noise, clear and cruel, carrying on the wind like a shard of ice. It was my daughter, Serafina. "Who is that old woman out there?" one of Aurelia's friends had asked, loud enough to be heard. Serafina turned, her posture radiating an effortless, chilling calm. "Oh, just let her watch from the parking lot," she'd said, her tone as smooth and polished as the pearls at her throat. "She isn't really his grandmother after all." The words didn't just sting, they detonated something deep within me. The trembling in my hands, a constant companion of my 72 years, suddenly ceased. The shame that had prickled my skin didn't vanish, but it crystallized, hardening into a resolve so dense it felt like a new spine had been forged within me. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a strategy, a quiet, bloodless campaign to rewrite my existence, to edit me out of the story until I was nothing more than a footnote, unread and unremembered. But my husband, Julian, had whispered something to me on a night thick with the sterile scent of medicine and impending loss. "Silence is not surrender, Elara," he had said, his voice a thread against the hum of his oxygen machine. "And dignity never begs for a seat at the table." That night, standing in the cold, I finally understood. The cake in my arms felt impossibly heavy, a monument to a love Serafina was trying to declare null and void. My vision blurred, but the world inside me sharpened into a clarity that was terrifying and absolute. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the pantomime of celebration through the glass. I watched them bring out another cake, a store-bought confection far grander than mine. I watched them sing to Aurelia, her name a chorus on their lips while mine was an unspoken ghost. When the party finally waned, Aurelia emerged, her pink shoes tapping a hesitant rhythm on the cold asphalt. "Abuela," she whispered, her eyes wide and confused. "Why didn't you come inside?" Before I could answer, Serafina materialized between us, a perfectly manicured hand on Aurelia's shoulder, a beautiful, unmovable wall. "Because, darling," Serafina said, her voice laced with a false, instructive gentleness, "you have to learn who belongs in the picture, and your grandmother doesn't." Aurelia's small nod was a dagger in my heart. I clutched my cake box, swallowed the burning tears, and turned away, the city night pressing down on me with an unbearable weight. Back in the stark silence of my apartment, I placed the cake in the refrigerator, its candles unlit, its purpose unfulfilled. I sat by the window, watching the 1,000 lighted squares of other lives, other families, other birthdays, and felt an isolation so profound it was like drowning. Then, I picked up the phone and dialed the number I hadn't used in years. When Marcus Thorne's calm, aged voice answered, I said only 2 words. "It's time." When you have been loved by a man as quiet and brilliant as Julian Vance, the silence he leaves behind becomes a second language, a lexicon of memory and meaning. He was never a man of grand pronouncements. We met in 1974 in a small cafe tucked inside a Cambridge University library where I served coffee to students who barely saw me. He came in every Tuesday, ordered black tea with lemon, and immersed himself in thick tomes of constitutional law. He never looked down on me, only at me, with eyes that seemed to read the stories I carried rather than the uniform I wore. The week he finally asked me out, I had just been rejected from a secretarial pool for the 3rd time. "It doesn't matter what you do," he told me, his voice low and steady. "It matters who you are." He became a formidable lawyer, his name whispered with respect in the hushed halls of Boston's most powerful firms. By the time we married, I had given up my own modest ambitions to raise Serafina. He wanted me to finish my degree, but life intervened, teething and fevers, school plays and bills. We were happy, or so I had let myself believe. The illusion fractured years into our marriage when I found a letter tucked inside one of his law books. The handwriting was elegant, young. The words were carefully chosen, but their intimacy was unmistakable. I never confronted him. I folded the letter, placed it back where I found it, and a silent, invisible fissure opened between us. I stayed. I stayed for Serafina, for the sanctity of the family I had built, and because despite the hairline crack in its foundation, I still loved him. To his credit, Julian tried. He planned trips, gave me a small desk in his study, and encouraged my tutoring of neighborhood children. When the cancer came, it was my hands that soothed his fevered brow, my voice that read to him in the long dark hours, not the woman from the letter. The night before he passed, he summoned Marcus Thorne to our home. The air was thick with the scent of orange peels I'd left on the counter and the rhythmic hum of the machine that helped him breathe. He locked his gaze with mine, his eyes clear despite the weakness of his body. "Elara," he said, each word an effort, "if she ever uses your silence against you, you must protect yourself." I didn't understand, but Marcus, standing solemn by the bedside, nodded. He passed Julian a folder. With a shaky hand, Julian signed the last page. "I don't know who Serafina will become without me," he continued, his gaze shifting to some distant point beyond the walls of the room. "But if she becomes someone who forgets where she came from, if she dishonors you in front of Aurelia, this document will protect what truly matters." It was a secret amendment to his $412 million trust, a fail-safe he had constructed with the same meticulous precision he applied to his legal cases, hidden even from our financial advisors. The terms were brutal and direct. Should Serafina ever publicly humiliate me in the presence of witnesses, particularly in front of Aurelia Vance, all her rights as trustee would be immediately and permanently revoked, transferred to a neutral third party. Julian had then recorded a message on a small camera, a final testament not just for me, but for Aurelia. It was notarized, sealed, and entrusted to Marcus. He even managed a faint smile at the end of the recording, his voice, unlike his body, never wavering. Then he closed his eyes, and the silence he left behind became my world. After the funeral, Serafina, clad in impeccable black, informed me, "Dad didn't leave you the trust out of love, Mother. He left it because he knew you'd be too unsophisticated to touch it until I was ready for it." I didn't argue. I let her believe her own convenient fictions. I lived simply, clipping coupons and taking the bus, never touching the principal, never reminding her whose brilliance had built the fortune she so readily claimed. But I kept Marcus Thorne's number, and I kept the sapphire blue dress Julian had bought me, tucked away in the back of my closet. Now, sitting at my kitchen table, the phone still warm in my hand, I remembered every detail of that night, every prophetic word. He knew. Somehow, he knew this day would come. I was never comfortable with computers. Julian used to say I was born to write letters, not passwords. That's why I didn't think anything of it when the quarterly trust statements stopped arriving in my email. When I couldn't log into the bank portal, I blamed my own fumbling fingers, my own aging mind. I told myself Serafina was handling it, but Marcus was methodical. After my call, he initiated a full audit. What he uncovered was colder and more calculating than anything I could have imagined. The login credentials had been changed. The recovery email was now a subtle forgery of my own, a single digit altered. It had been created just 2 days before a transfer of $2.7 million was authorized, funneled into a Delaware LLC named Aura Strategies, a boutique PR firm registered under Serafina's married name. There was no signed authorization from me, only a copy of a forged email, supposedly from my account. "Let's move forward with this," it read. "Serafina has my full blessing." Marcus traced the metadata. The IP address originated from Serafina's townhouse. The browser was her MacBook. The bank had flagged the transaction, but with no one contesting it, the transfer went through. That was only the beginning of the chill. A few days later, an envelope arrived. It was a thank you note from the restaurant addressed to a Mrs. Elara Sanchez. Confused, I opened it. Inside was a copy of the event's guest list. Host, Serafina Wallace. VIP guests included Aurelia Vance, Dr. Morgan Lee, and Mrs. Elara Sanchez. It wasn't a typo. My maiden name was Castillo. My married name was Vance. I had never been Sanchez. She erased you, Elara, Marcus said, his voice thin with a rage he rarely showed. Legally, you were never even there. It was a premeditated act, a cruel piece of paperwork designed to strip me of any claim, any connection, any presence in my own granddaughter's life. She was using my silence, just as Julian had warned. She was weaponizing it to rewrite history. A week later, Marcus received an encrypted, anonymous email. The subject, "Check the Vance Trust. She's bleeding it dry." Attached were screenshots, access logs, timestamps, a complete blueprint of the theft. Someone on the inside was watching. This was no longer about a ruined birthday. This was war. The cruelest cuts are rarely delivered with a shout. They come disguised as etiquette, wrapped in polite smiles and soft tones that leave wounds you can't see but feel for years. I had spent decades believing I was too sensitive, that I was misinterpreting the 1,000 tiny humiliations. But with the evidence from Marcus spread across my kitchen table, the past rearranged itself into a horrifyingly clear pattern. I had been in the process of being erased long before my name was changed on a guest list. It began the week of Serafina's wedding. I was in the laundry room carefully steaming the wrinkles from her ivory silk gown, a dress paid for with the money Julian and I had carefully saved. She walked in, phone pressed to her ear. "Don't touch the veil," she said sharply, not even looking at me. "You'll scorch it. And Mother, please don't wear white. People might get confused." I managed a weak laugh. "No one will confuse me with the bride, mija." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes cold. "You'd be surprised." At the reception, when the photographer gathered the family, I stood behind a 7-year-old Aurelia, my hand on her small shoulder. "Just the immediate family for now," Serafina called out. I stepped back, my smile frozen on my face, and waited. The call for the extended family never came. I was not in a single photograph in her wedding album. For Aurelia's high school graduation, I spent months embroidering a shawl with tiny blue forget-me-nots. Serafina told me the ceremony had limited, family-only seating. I watched the live stream on my tablet, seeing empty chairs beside the dog groomer and Serafina's personal trainer. Later, she texted me a photo of Aurelia holding her diploma, the beautiful shawl I had made folded neatly over her arm, unworn. At holiday parties, I was sequestered in a back room, the door locked from the outside. "I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, Mother," she would coo. One year, I ate my Christmas dinner on top of the washing machine in the same laundry room where I had once steamed her wedding dress. "You were a nobody in Colombia," she told me once after I'd mispronounced an appetizer at a charity gala. "Don't embarrass me in Boston." I had absorbed every barb, every exclusion, every quiet act of cruelty, and packed it away like old letters. I had tried to be what she wanted, polished, quiet, grateful, invisible. Now, I understood why Julian had built his fortress of legalese around me. He had seen the rot of pride in his daughter, the kind that blossoms when a person mistakes wealth for worth. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. I went to my closet and retrieved a small wooden box from the top shelf. Inside were remnants of the life Serafina had tried to erase, my old lesson plans from tutoring, letters from Aurelia written in crayon, a photo of Julian holding a newborn Serafina. At the very bottom was a note from him. "For the only woman I trust to remember what matters." I ran my finger over the ink, then picked up the phone. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "Find out who sent that anonymous email, and prepare for battle." There is a particular kind of silence that descends when a grandchild stops calling. At first, you tell yourself it's school, friends, the natural process of growing up. But eventually, the silence starts to feel like a sentence, an exile you didn't earn. Aurelia had been my Thursday visitor since she was old enough to walk. But then one Thursday passed, then another, then a month. My texts went unanswered, my calls went to voicemail. When I asked Serafina, her answer was clipped. "She's busy, Mother. She'll call when she can." A letter I sent came back marked, "Return to sender," the envelope torn but unopened. The real shock, however, came on a rainy Saturday afternoon, not from the silence, but from the sound of a soft knock on my back door. It was Aurelia, pale and trembling, her eyes puffy from crying. She fell into my arms, and for a long time we just sat on the couch while I made tea, the silence between us heavy with unspoken things. "I found something, Abuela," she said finally, her voice hoarse. She took out her phone and played an audio file. It was Serafina's voice, cool and careless, on a phone call. "No, I'm not worried about her. She's a relic with a dead man's checkbook. Once this last transfer clears, we'll dissolve the account and she'll be taken care of." My blood ran cold. "I recorded it 2 nights ago," Aurelia whispered. She didn't know I was in the hall. She then pulled out a crumpled envelope from her bag. She tore this up. I found it in her wastebasket. It was my returned letter, with its watercolor bird on the front. "I thought you were mad at me," she cried, the tears finally coming. "Mom told me you were trying to manipulate me, that you were jealous of her success." I held her, stroking her hair. "You were just a child, mija, trying to love 2 different shores." She looked up, her young face hardening with a familiar resolve. "Not anymore." I sent the recording to Marcus Thorne. He told me about the clause in Grandpa's trust, about what happens if she disrespects you in front of me. Her eyes widened as she saw the recognition in my face. "You knew." "Your grandfather," I said softly, "saw the woman she was becoming." Aurelia took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then let's finish what he started." The next morning, Marcus arrived as the first light of dawn was spilling over the city. He carried a slim briefcase. On my small television, we inserted the thumb drive he brought. Julian appeared on the screen, looking tired but resolute in his favorite armchair. He spoke directly to the camera as if addressing a jury. "This money was never for power," he said, his voice resonating with a strength that defied his illness. "It was for protection, for Ilara." He leaned forward. "No success should be built on the erasure of those who gave you life. If my daughter uses your silence, Ilara, if she makes you invisible in your own family, I want you to have this." His final words were for his granddaughter. "Protect Ilara, Aurelia, and protect your own heart. Never confuse silence with submission." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Marcus then played Aurelia's recording of Serafina, followed by a shaky cell phone video someone had taken from the parking lot that night, a video that had, unbeknownst to me, gone viral on social media. "Can you believe they're making her stand outside in the cold?" a voice on the video said. "We had proof. Overwhelming, irrefutable proof." The emergency hearing before the Financial Trust Oversight Board was swift. Serafina, flanked by a high-priced lawyer, tried to dismiss it all as a family misunderstanding. But Marcus laid out the evidence with devastating precision. The forged email, the IP logs, Julian's video, Aurelia's recording, the doctored guest list, the viral video that had turned public opinion into a raging torrent against her. The board, after reviewing Julian's secret amendment, voted unanimously. Serafina's authority as trustee was suspended. All accounts were frozen. Her face, a mask of carefully constructed composure, finally cracked. Outside, news alerts were already flashing on people's phones. PR mogul accused of fraud, elder abuse in shocking trust battle. By midnight, investors were pulling their support from Aura Strategies. Serafina released a terse statement about private family matters, but it was drowned out by a tidal wave of public outrage. Her carefully curated empire of image and influence was beginning to crumble. That night, holding Aurelia in my arms, I finally understood. Protection doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it whispers across time, a promise from a man who loved me enough to see the future. The day of the court hearing, I wore a simple gray suit, the one Julian always said made my eyes look like soft twilight. In the cold, polished courtroom, Serafina sat with her chin held high, a statue of defiant pride. When the judge called the case, my heart didn't pound. It settled into a steady, powerful rhythm. Marcus presented the case, not with theatrics, but with the cold, hard weight of facts. When the judge finally spoke, the room was utterly silent. "Miss Wallace," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you have committed forgery, misrepresented familial relations, and misappropriated over $2 million in trust funds. By virtue of the amendment created by your father, Julian Vance, your actions trigger the automatic and permanent revocation of your trustee powers. You are hereby ordered to make full restitution, and this court will be forwarding its findings to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into criminal fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Serafina's face went ashen. She looked for the first time utterly and completely defeated. Outside, the explosion of flashbulbs was blinding. Headlines were already being written. PR queen dethroned by silenced mother. Within days, Serafina's world had completely disintegrated. Her lead clients terminated their contracts. Her partners distanced themselves. Aura Strategies was a sinking ship. That evening, Aurelia posted a single photo of the two of us on the courthouse steps, my hand in hers. The caption read, "She called her invisible. Now the world sees her." The post was shared tens of thousands of times. The comments were a flood of support, a chorus of voices for a woman who had been voiceless for so long. Serafina never apologized, but it no longer mattered. In the quiet of my small kitchen, cooking with my granddaughter, the memory of all those small, silent humiliations finally lost its power. The pain had not vanished, but it had been transmuted into something else entirely: strength. The building wasn't grand. It was a modest brick storefront on a quiet street in Cambridge, with a hand-painted sign that read, "The Hearthstone Legacy, a place to read, learn, and be remembered." It was a free literacy and conversation center for elderly immigrants, for all the other women who had been pushed into the shadows, their stories silenced by a world that moved too fast. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Aurelia stood beside me. When it was her turn to speak, she looked at the crowd, her voice clear and strong. "My grandmother never raised her voice," she said, her eyes finding mine. But she raised me. She taught me that dignity isn't loud, it's persistent. She didn't lose her voice. She saved it. For the day the world was finally ready to listen. When I stepped up to the podium, my hands were steady. I unfolded a letter, written in the English I had worked so hard to master. "My name is Elara Vance," I began. "I came to this country with a suitcase and a heart full of apology. For 40 years, I believed that my silence was a shield. But silence can also be a cage." I looked out at the faces, seeing tears in the eyes of strangers. I was told I did not belong. I was told I did not matter. And for a very long time, I believed it. But I did not come to this country to be erased. I may not have been born into applause, but I will not die in silence. The crowd rose to their feet, not with a roar, but with a wave of profound, respectful applause. That afternoon, my first class gathered, 5 women, all over 60, from Haiti, from Laos, from Mexico. Their hands, wrinkled and unsure, held their pens. "Today," I told them, my voice soft but firm, "we will learn to say our names as if they are sacred." As the sun set, casting long shadows from the elm trees outside, the room glowed with a warm, hopeful light. After the class, Aurelia and I sat by the window, sipping tea. "Do you miss her?" she asked quietly. I watched the city lights begin to sparkle. "I miss the little girl she used to be," I said, "not the woman she chose to become." She nodded, then handed me a small faded photograph she'd found. It was of Julian and me with a baby Aurelia in a stroller. On the back, in his familiar script, he had written, "Love is not volume, it is presence." As we were leaving, one of the women from my class returned, pressing a small bag of oranges into my hand. "Maestra," she whispered, "you speak so softly. But I hear you louder than anyone." I stood in the doorway for a long time after she left, the cool night air smelling of oranges and old paper and new beginnings. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, wholly present. Not invisible, not waiting, just me.